Good morning.
Open it up.
It's good to have everyone with us this morning. We are in our 24th lesson on the book of Hebrews, beginning in chapter 9. Chapter 9 is an interesting chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters, but chapter 9 is the climactic architect of the book of Hebrews. You had in chapter 1, Jesus is the conduit of divine communication because it is through the Son whom God now speaks. In chapter 2, he is the perfect representation of humanity. He is the bio-representation of God. In chapter 3, he is the architect of the house of God. Chapter 4, he is the rest giver. In chapter 5, he's the high priest. Chapter 6 sees him as the surety of the oath and the promise. In chapter 7, he is he's the representation of a greater priesthood. In chapter 8, pretty much the same thing. It just carries on the same thought. I don't know why there's a chapter break there, but in chapter 9, now he is setting up the tabernacle for the Day of Atonement. The sacrifice is being slain, and the blood of atonement is being sprinkled, and now the high priest is ready to enter into the holy place. The first covenant, he says in verses 1 through 10, the first covenant was represented by an earthly tabernacle. Now he's going to go all the way back to the Day of Atonement. He's going to explain the symbolism of the tabernacle and all of the things connected to it. So the first covenant was a representation. The first covenant was represented by an earthly tabernacle in Leviticus chapters 1 through 3. Now he says, then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. Now, incidentally, the word sanctuary is typically used to refer to the outer sanctuary beyond the first veil, but the word is also used to refer to the Holy of Holies. Sometimes it isn't always clear which one is being, yet depending on the context. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant overlaid with gold overlaid on all sides with gold, in which was the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the wings of the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these we cannot now speak in detail. Now, when these things had thus been prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. But unto the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered first for himself and then for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the Holy of Holies was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was a symbol for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to conscience, concerned only with food and drink and various washings and fleshly ordinances imposed until the day of Reformation. Going back to the beginning of this segment, even the first covenant, what does that signify? The word even, what does that suggest? I think this is a perfect case for the silent hermeneutic. If he says even the first.
What does silent hermeneutic mean? I don't know that.
How to explain that? Well, hermeneutic is just a way of understanding the text. There's different methods that you used to ascertain the truth of text. In interpretation, which I utterly despise, you have all kinds of things that are brought in upon the text. But hermeneutics is just a way of understanding the text. The silent hermeneutic would be an application of truth that is not directly stated in the text. Even the first covenant, what does that tell us then about the new covenant? That it too has ordinances of divine service. See, the word even requires a comparison, doesn't it? So, the other side of the coin, or the ultimate conclusion then, is even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service. How much more so than the second covenant? Because the first covenant is just a covenant of ordinances that related to fleshly needs, washings, sprinklings, these kinds of things. But even the first covenant, now what that tells us is that there is an established pattern of service. There's an established methodology of worship under the first covenant. Even the first covenant had ordinances of divine services. So if there is an established, accepted pattern or method of worship, who established that? God did. Only God has the right to say what he will accept as worship. And human interpretation doesn't even enter into it. We have absolutely no right to change it, to enhance it. We have no right to infringe upon it in any way. If you don't believe that, ask Nadab and Abihu. They chose to infringe upon it and offer fire which God did not command, and that didn't sit well with the Almighty, and he consumed them. So there is established patterns of worship and service, not just for the first covenant, but also how much more so for the second covenant. So this really represents a silent hermeneutic. Now, the earthly tabernacle consisted of three separate components. You had the courtyard, then you had the tent of meeting, or the sanctuary, then you had the Holy of Holies. The tent of meeting was the place for the priests. Now, in verses 1 through 7, the tabernacle is pictured as a set of symbols. And he's really quoting from Exodus chapter, well, I'm not going to say quoting, he's drawing from Exodus chapter 25, verses 23 through 40. But as a symbol, the tabernacle was the place where God promised to meet with his people and bless them with forgiveness. You can go to Exodus chapter 25, again in Leviticus chapters 4 and 5. But in chapter 9, Jesus is making the true tabernacle ready for the Day of Atonement. And the high priest is now preparing to enter the sanctuary. The outer sanctuary. Now, all of the materials, he lists a number of materials here associated with the outer sanctuary, and all of the materials of its construction and its furnishings. These all represented the best that man could offer for such a holy presence. Everything was made out of gold. Everything was made out of precious things. These things are certainly unworthy to represent God, but they represent the best that man can offer. So God commands these things to be made out of these ingredients. It was there in the presence, it was there in the sanctuary, or in the tent of meetings, that the priests carried out their daily responsibilities of burning the morning and the evening incense, filling and trimming the lamps or the oil lamps, as well as changing out the showbread every first day, every Sabbath day. Every Sabbath morning they would have to exchange the bread. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, he says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a person sins," now this is the context, to tell you what is being addressed here. He's talking about a sin offering being offered for an individual who sins, or for a priest who sins. He said, if a person sins unintentionally, so you have sins of ignorance being committed here, against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people. So you have two different scenarios by which this is about to be offered. Then let him offer to the Lord for his sins, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish, as a sin offering. So this is a context. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the bull's head and kill it before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it into the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting. So what you have in this kind of setting is, on this type of occasion and for this particular reason, this is the only time blood is ever sprinkled in the sanctuary. No other sacrifice requires this. But the officiating priest, doesn't have to be the high priest, the officiating priest slays the bull, and all animals were slain before the tabernacle, or before the veil, before the sanctuary. Yeah, before the sanctuary, before the first veil.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, all animals were except for one. I guess what that would be.
The lamb that was sent out once a year?
That's what I was thinking.
No, actually, that one is not slain.
But the one is slain and one is a scapegoat.
Right. But the only one that is not slain before the tent of meeting is the red heifer. Slain outside the camp. And blood sprinkled toward the entrance of the tabernacle. Anyway, all of the sacrifices are slain before the Lord, before the first veil, in the presence of the Lord. And in this particular offering, the blood is taken by the officiating priest into the sanctuary and sprinkled. He dipped his finger in the blood 7 times and sprinkled it before the second veil, offering atonement for the sin. The outer sanctuary represented a number of things. It represented the limitation of God's presence. Yes?
The sacrifice that was made that you were just talking about, it was an unintentional sin?
Right.
And was it?
Wasn't like the guilt offering.
But was it the priest that did the unintentional sin, or another priest that offered the sacrifice?
It could be the one officiating. It could be offering for his sin, or it could have been for any individual who made an unintentional sin.
So it was just in case type.
No, sin has actually been committed.
But do they know it, or if it's unintentional?
The idea of the unintentional sin was, if it becomes known, after the point it becomes known, then you had to go to the tabernacle, offer the sacrifice, blood sprinkled. What if it never became known? Then it's taken care of on the Day of Atonement. So, the outer sanctuary represented the limited presence of God. God chose to dwell among His people, but He chose only to dwell among them in a very limited fashion. His chosen dwelling place was where? Between the wings of the cherubim on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant that rested in the Holy of Holies. That was where He chose to dwell among His people. Also represented limited approachability, because even though God is dwelling in that tent, that tabernacle among His people, only one person could approach Him. And then that represented limited approachability, because He could only do that one day a year. So a lot of limitations established here. Now, the first veil separated the sanctuary from the courtyard. Now, the tabernacle was as a whole, was a symbol itself of the actual state of relations between God and man. The courtyard was the place of admittance for the people. All the people, well, all of Israel, the Gentiles could not enter here. They were out in the courtyard. Gentiles, which was beyond the courtyard of the women. Now, this, in the courtyard, the people of God assembled, and there they could bring their offerings, and the priest would offer them up on the altar of burnt offering. This was the place where the people were accepted. But this was the last place they were accepted. You can't go beyond this point. You can't enter the sanctuary. You can only assemble here in the courtyard. So this represented limitations. This was the area of some 60 yards by 30 yards, and it was all framed around by curtains. And you can read the description of that in the book of Exodus and Numbers. But this was the place of the altar of burnt offering. This was the place where the sinner and the unclean could come and obtain forgiveness of sin and cleansing for whatever malady may have afflicted them, like leprosy. This was the realm of human services to God. What kind of services were offered here? Well, the individual who sinned brings his animal here. He lays his hand on the head of the animal. He slays his own sacrifice. And then the priest offers it upon the altar and sprinkles the blood, which would have been applied to some portion of the altar. This was the realm of human services. This separated man from the presence of God who dwelt beyond the veils. As far as the people were concerned, you can come here, but no further. Every sacrifice that was slain before the veil of the sanctuary, and his blood sprinkled between the veils, sprinkled before the veil. Now, the sanctuary itself stood between the courtyard and what? The Holy of Holies. So you have this intermediate place here. This belonged to whom? This belonged to the priests. What were the priests? They were the mediators. Someone to stand between the people and their God.
So that's first before the...
Right. So that sanctuary, that was their place. They could enter there. The commoner could not. Then you had the Holy of Holies beyond the second veil. This was the place beyond which the priest could not go. The priest, you can come here, but no further. Only the high priest can enter beyond that point, and then only 1 day per year. But the inside of the sanctuary, you had the lampstand, I call it the menorah, made out of pure gold, and hammered work. In other words, this was to be work of skilled craftsmanship. Anytime you see the word hammered, usually refers to skilled workmanship. You had the lamps that were in 3 bunches of two different groups of 3 on each side of the lampstand. You had the cups of each branch that were to be shaped like an almond blossom, consisting of both the bulb and the flower. And these were all to be of 1 piece of gold with the lampstand. In other words, this was all one massive chunk of gold. Very craftfully constructed. Then you had the accompanying snuffers.
That wasn't my grandmother.
No, that wasn't your grandmother's snuff box. He's not suggesting the priests were snuff dippers. This is what put out the candles. And these 2 were made of pure gold. Then you had the table of showbread. Yes.
Is this the pattern for the Catholic Church today and all the?
I'm sure they get that in all of their, what do you call it, their ceremony, all of their ceremonial stuff. A lot of it comes right out of the Old Testament pattern. Why they still use it, I haven't a clue. One thing that does, it gives a sense of grandeur, and this attracts people. People are attracted to that. And
It's like,
it's a very structured type thing, and that appeals to a great many people.
It stays the same.
the structure, it's kind of like the king and the queen. It's the
Yeah.
pomp and circumstance, they must know a lot.
Yeah, it elevates them, but I'm really unworthy to approach.
It can also turn people off.
Yeah, it does, but as far as the appeal, look at the massive number of people to whom this appeals.
Well, and all that stuff was God ordained.
Well, in
All
the
that-
law of
yeah.
Moses,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah,
ordained.
yeah.
All of this other stuff is just human creation.
Not 100% because we say it's a pattern of God, so.
Well, they take some of these symbols and they readapted them to their own use. In other words, they've destroyed the symbolism. We'll get into that here in just a moment.
I always thought that those curtains that had been embroidered with pomegranates and those are beautiful.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Inlaid with gold, interwoven with gold. That had to have been a massively gorgeous.
And it wasn't this big. I mean,
It was like 4 inches wide or thick. This is a big piece of curtain.
I'm talking about it all. The
Yeah.
candles and everything, they weren't tiny.
Right, yeah, they were, well, like the Ark of the Covenant, or the table of showbread, rather. It was about, I don't know, maybe a little more than a foot shorter than this table. And it was about half as tall, and maybe about an inch wider than this table is. Sort of give you an idea of how big the Ark of the Covenant was. But, you know, I'm sorry, not the Ark, the table of showbread. Gives you a pretty good idea how big the table of showbread was. But that table was overlaid with gold. It had gold borders around it. It had a border around, a rim around it that was laced with gold. A beautiful table. But on that was the showbread. This was also called the bread of face or the bread of presence, because it was always before the presence of the Lord. It was to remain there for the entire week. And on the morning of every Sabbath, the priest would come in and they would replace those 12 loaves, which represented the 12 tribes, of course, which was baked of fine flour with salt. Salt of the covenant had to be used. And the priest would then eat what would have been for the previous week. Well, it's still good bread.
It's stale, sitting out all week on the table.
But that was God's portion given to the priest, and they consumed that on the Sabbath morning, or the Sabbath day, and when they replaced it. But the second veil separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. Now, the second veil stood between God and the priests. Not even those who mediated on behalf of the people were permitted beyond this point. The priest, you can come here, but you can come no further. So the Holy of Holies contained, he says, the golden censer or the golden fire pan. Your translation may say the golden altar. Does anyone have a translation that says altar? If you do, that's not right. The word actually means it's a censer or a fire pan. Now, you wouldn't believe the controversy that this one little verse has stirred up among scholars. Because their claim is that this is never mentioned with regard to the Holy of Holies anywhere in the Old Testament. I beg to differ. But it's amazing how some of these commentators, I wonder sometimes if they even read it before they make a comment about it. But a lot of controversy has been stirred up, even to the point of questioning the viability of the book of Hebrews and the authenticity of the authorship. Because this leads some to the conclusion that the author is wrong, because the Old Covenant did not suggest the altar or the censer being used. So, some even questioning the inspiration of the author himself. But in Leviticus chapter 16, verses 12 and 14, he seems very clear about this. Then he shall take a censer full of burning coals from the fire from the altar before the Lord. In other words, out in the courtyard you have the altar of burnt offerings. He takes fire from that offering, he puts it in a fire pan or censer, and he brings that inside the veil. What veil is he talking about? He brings this into the Holy of Holies. And he shall put the incense on the fire before the Lord. What is the fire before the Lord? He just brought in a fire pan full of fire. It's before the Lord. He's also required to take in a handful of incense. He places that on the fire before the Lord. The smoke fills over the Ark of the Covenant, lest he die. So this, I can't think of a clearer passage that tells us exactly what this is and why it was used and when it was used. So this is done to represent the prayers of the people. This is the incense. And just like the altar of incense that's burning in the sanctuary, that incense goes up before the Lord. That represents the prayers of the people. This does pretty much the same thing, represents the same thing. but it covers the mercy seat. That, I find that interesting. The smoke covers the mercy seat, lest the high priest die. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood blood of the bull. And he's talking about the bull that was for the sin offering of the people, the whole nation. And he shall sprinkle, in other words, he dips his finger 7 times in the blood. And he sprinkled it before the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant.
Then you talk about on the Day of Atonement, or just?
Yes, Day of
Okay.
Atonement. Yeah.
Not just regular worship, this is the Day of Atonement.
Right, yeah, in
When they
chapter
send the goat-
9.
Send the goat out in the wilderness to carry the sins away.
Right, this is exactly what he's doing in chapter 9. He's setting up the tabernacle for the Day of Atonement. The priest is about to offer the sacrifice, and he is about to enter the Holy of Holies, which we'll see in chapter 10. So evidently the golden censer did not reside permanently in the Holy of Holies, because this is something the high priest has to take in with him. But because it is only used in the Holy of Holies on that day, the Hebrew writer apparently lists this as part of the furniture of the Holy of Holies. That's why he uses this, makes this statement. The only other thing in the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. This is the throne room of the Almighty. This is where God chose to dwell among his people between the wings of the cherubim. And God established the link between the symbolism and what the symbols represent. And since God is the one who chooses the symbolism, that sort of closes the door on any speculation as to the meaning of the things these things symbolize, doesn't it? The first tabernacle stood against the backdrop of the unseen because it was a pattern. It was patterned after the true tabernacle that was shown to him in heaven, or described to him from the heavens. The first tabernacle represented a world that was completely beyond the reach of man. That tabernacle served to remind man how holy God was and how unworthy I am to enter into his presence. The entire tabernacle is set up to impress upon the mind of man the holiness of God and how unworthy I am to come before his presence. Now, the very structure of the tabernacle was to impose limits. These limits were established to regulate how far man could come in his worship to God, in the presence of God, and the people could come first before the veil and no further. The priests could then enter the sanctuary, but they could not enter any further. Only the high priest could come beyond that point, and then only one day a year. So all of this represented limitations, and it represented the actual status of the relationship between God and man. The meaning of the typology is determined by the Holy Spirit. Who has the right to assign meaning to revealed symbols? God, and no one else. Therefore the Holy Spirit says, notice, the Holy Spirit indicating this. Now that means this and nothing else. That the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, not yet known, not yet understood, not yet made known to man. While the first tabernacle was standing, it was a symbol for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service, in other words, the priest, it cannot make him perfect in regard to conscience. Concerning, this is concerned only with foods and drinks and various washing. In other words, all of this was designed for the purification of the flesh. It did absolutely nothing for the purification of the conscience. It doesn't take away the guilt. Until, all of this was imposed until the time of Reformation, or the time of perfection, if you will. So the symbol was ultimately concerned only with fleshly needs and fleshly purification. Food, drink, various washings. It simply couldn't supply the spiritual needs necessary to close the distance between God and man. Now, as long as that system was in place, there was no hope for man to be able to come into the real presence of the Almighty. The First Tabernacle, the law, the priesthood, all of this was a testimony to human inadequacy. We're unworthy. And there's nothing we can do about it. There's almost a hopelessness there. The function of that tabernacle and those offerings were intended to be transitory. It's not going to be this way forever. There's going to be a time of reformation. There's going to be a time of perfecting where this is no longer, these limitations are no longer going to be in place. Those sacrifices were still being offered at the time, and this seems to be, I think, pretty much conclusive from the language of the text. Notice how he says that these are offered. These things are being offered. They cannot make the worshiper make perfect conscience. These things relate only to physical things. So these are all present tense verbs. So these rituals were still in place, or still being offered when this was being written. Now, but God had already abandoned the system. Thus, these things were now being offered in a pointless effort. These things have already since been overturned. But the new covenant, verses 11 through 17, is represented by the greater and more perfect tabernacle. But when Christ came as a high priest of good things to come, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with hands and not of this creation. He did not enter by the blood of bulls and calves, or goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer, sprinkling on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctified them, so that their bodies were clean, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, purify the conscience? One is for the flesh, the other is for the conscience, from dead works, or from the works of death, so that he may serve the living God. Therefore, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance, now that he has died to redeem them from the transgression committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to establish the death of the one who made it, because a will does not take effect until the one who made it has died. It cannot be executed while he still lives. The officiating priest, the officiating high priest, is now God himself. He is officiating at his own sacrifice. He enters the heavenly sanctuary with the blood of superior value. The degree of superiority is measured by the gulf between the two things. How much more superior is the blood of this sacrifice than that of the previous sacrifices? What is the measurement? the superiority is that blood is as superior to that of bulls and goats as God is to a bull or a goat. That's how much more superior. The blood of bulls and goats was a constant reminder of sin every year. And he's not talking about the day-to-day sacrifices. He's talking about every year the nation comes together, and every year sin is remembered. And we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 10. But unlike the blood of bulls and goats, the blood of Jesus has the power to actually redeem man, to remove the sin, so that there is no longer a remembrance for sin, thus providing a clean conscience for the worshiper. This is First Peter chapter 3, isn't it?
And that's the good news.
That's the good news.
I go back to Shayla's point about the externals and the pomp and circumstance. It was all temporary.
Yeah.
Galatians tells us the old law was our schoolmaster. You didn't learn you didn't learn on the school bus. Well, I did learn some things, but it wasn't good. But the school bus just took us to school where the learning took place. This externals was temporary. Now we've got something so much better. Why would, Shayla, we hold on, or why would we want to hold on to what we had in the past that was inferior to what we've got now? And I think that's the disconnect. I was waiting to kind of address your question. Why would people do? I think it's being uninformed scripturally, but I also think it's a matter of teaching, okay, that was good, but Jesus is better. And I think that's the key of Hebrews. Jesus is better.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the whole, when we get a chance to talk
So
to
it's
people
a
like
matter
that
of
and show them.
maturity.
I think so. Maturity and education, maybe. I don't know how to, if that sounds right or not.
Education, yeah, it would be the education.
Is that right?
That's
Yeah.
what I would say.
Well, there are some people that are educated, but they do not want to, they don't want to
They
take
don't
that.
accept the truth.
I understand that. I get it. I'm just, when I said education, though, I meant biblical
Yeah.
education. But
Well-
we just have to teach and let seeds fall where they may.
And that's what I was saying. I mean, for some people, it's appealing, and others, it's not. And I think it's the routine and the ritual and I'm better than you, and I can never live up to that kind of mentality that
Yeah.
turns people off.
Yeah.
We're out of time. Let's go ahead and stop right there, and I'll rehash this. We'll start here next week, looking at this point. Does anyone have any questions or comments? All right, we'll pick up there next week.